The reception hall of the luxurious hotel was impeccable. White and gold flowers adorned the space, creating a striking contrast against the glow of crystal chandeliers. The guests, most dressed in expensive attire with polished smiles, gathered in small groups, exchanging formal greetings and curious glances. Emily Hill and Mark Anderson's wedding was about to begin, and the tension in the air was unmistakable. David Hill, the father of the bride, watched the room with a barely concealed look of disapproval. He stood in the corner beside his wife, Linda, both impeccably dressed for the occasion. While his daughter's wedding should have been a cause for joy, something just didn't sit right with him. Emily was about to marry a man who, in his eyes, wasn't worthy of their family. "I can't believe this is really happening," David muttered to Linda, crossing his arms, his expression stern. "Mark Anderson, what does Emily see in him? He's not even half of what she deserves." Linda nodded, adjusting the pearls around her neck. "I know, David, but she's in love. And when Emily sets her mind on something, there's no changing it." "Love is fleeting," David responded with an exasperated sigh. "But stability, security, that's what really matters. Mark doesn't have any of that." Meanwhile, across the hall, Emily stood surrounded by her bridesmaids, smiling as they made the final adjustments to her gown. She knew her parents didn't approve of Mark, but in that moment, nothing could shake her resolve. She was about to marry the man she loved, and that was all that mattered. Mark, on the other hand, was more nervous than he cared to admit. Dressed in a simple suit, he observed the bustle of the room while chatting with his best friend and best man, Tom. "You all right, man?" Tom asked, giving him a light pat on the back. Mark laughed, trying to hide the anxiety. "Yeah, of course. I'm just trying not to think too much about the looks I'm going to get." Tom shook his head, understanding exactly what he meant. "You knew it would be like this from the start. The Hills aren't exactly easy to impress." "I know," Mark sighed. "But Emily's worth it. She always has been." Tom smiled. "That's true, and at the end of the day, that's all that matters." But as the ceremony drew nearer, Tom's reassurance couldn't quiet the feeling that to Emily's family, he would never be enough. Mark knew this marriage was more than just love. It was also a silent battle against the disdain of a wealthy, powerful family. The hall doors began to open slowly, and the guests were called to take their seats for the ceremony. Emily took one last glance at herself in the mirror before entering, adjusting her veil with a nervous smile. Her heart raced, but it wasn't from fear. It was from excitement. As David and Linda made their way to their seats in the front row, the tension between them was evident. David glanced at the altar, adorned with flowers and candles, feeling torn between happiness for his daughter and frustration over the man she had chosen. When Mark finally entered the hall and took his place at the altar, the murmurs among the guests became more noticeable. He stood with his chin held high, trying to ignore the judgmental looks cast his way. But deep down, he knew this would be just the first of many moments where he would be tested. Then, the music began to play, signaling Emily's entrance. All eyes turned to her, and for a brief moment, the tension melted away. Emily was radiant, and when Mark saw her, he forgot everything else around him. His smile widened as she approached, and in that instant, he knew that despite everything, this was right. But the real trials were still to come. The ceremony was brief but elegant. Emily and Mark exchanged heartfelt vows that moved a few guests, although whispers of disapproval still lingered in the air. The applause was polite, but lacked the enthusiasm one would expect on such a joyous occasion. Still, Mark held Emily's hand tightly, knowing the battle was far from over. During the reception, guests mingled in the beautifully decorated hall, where the sophistication of the Hill family was on full display. Mark tried to relax, but the glances and murmurs around him kept him on edge. John, Emily's uncle, and a businessman who always flaunted his successes, was the first to approach him. "So, Mark," John began with a smile that didn't reach his eyes as he picked up a glass of champagne. "I hear you're starting your own company. How's that project going?" Mark took a deep breath, recognizing the condescension in the question. "It's going well. We're closing some important partnerships." John raised an eyebrow, feigning interest. "Partnerships, you say? Interesting. Tell me, do you have any investors? You know, these small ventures can be a bit tricky without the right support." Mark clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. "We don't have external investors yet. We're financing everything independently." John gave a chuckle, this time letting out a slight laugh. "Independently, of course. That's admirable, but I hope you're thinking big. In the real world, without significant investments, well, the chances of success are slim." Before Mark could respond, Sarah, Emily's cousin, approached, clearly catching part of the conversation. "Oh, Mark, I was just telling John how much I admire what you're doing. It's really brave to try something like that, on your own." She smiled, but her tone was noticeably patronizing. Mark knew that although her words were polite, they carried an unspoken criticism. "Thanks, Sarah," he replied, trying to avoid prolonging the conversation. "I believe in what we're building." "And what exactly are you building?" John asked, his smug smile still present. "After all, the tech industry is competitive, don't you think?" Mark felt his blood boil. He was standing in hostile territory, and all he wanted was to enjoy his wedding day with Emily. But every word from her family seemed like a subtle attempt to chip away at his confidence, yet he wasn't ready to back down. "It is competitive, yes, but we're working on something that will stand out," Mark responded, his tone firm. "I'm not the kind of person who's intimidated by a challenge." Sarah and John exchanged glances, surprised by Mark's assertive reply. But before they could continue, Emily walked over, sensing the discomfort in the air. "Mark, can we talk for a minute?" She gently pulled him aside, aware of the tension. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, her voice soft but concerned. "I'm handling it," he said, trying to smile. "But your family isn't making it easy." Emily sighed. "I know. They can be difficult, but they'll come around. Once they see who you really are." Mark looked into her eyes, recognizing the unwavering support Emily had always given him, and despite the tense atmosphere, he smiled. "I hope so." As they moved to sit at a table, the subtle jabs continued. Each elite guest who approached had some sort of comment about Mark's career or a sarcastic remark about how he would adjust to Emily's lifestyle. Some pretended to be kind, but their tone revealed their true intentions. "I suppose you'll have to get used to events like this," one family friend said with a fake smile. "Emily's lifestyle is intense, to say the least. I hope you can keep up." Once again, Mark held back from responding defensively. The pressure of being the outsider in that world was overwhelming. He knew he didn't fit into the luxury and privilege surrounding him, but he also knew that his relationship with Emily was built on something far deeper than appearances. Still, the feeling of being constantly judged never left him. The humiliations, though discreet, felt like small cuts, slowly accumulating and testing his patience. And deep down, Mark knew there was an untold truth, something he had yet to reveal, something that would change everything. Mark stepped away from the buzz of the reception, needing a moment of silence to breathe. He walked out to the hotel garden, where the soft music from the event could still be heard in the background, but the fresh air and distant birdsongs helped clear his mind. Being surrounded by Emily's family, especially the Hills, was proving to be more draining than he had anticipated. However, the reason for his discomfort went far beyond what they could imagine. As he watched the sky darken, Mark couldn't help but let his thoughts drift back to a more painful time in his life. When he was just a teenager, his family had also held a position of prestige. His father, James Anderson, was a visionary, particularly in the field of technology. They weren't as wealthy as the Hills, but they lived comfortably, and the family was happy. Until everything fell apart. Mark vividly remembered the admiration his father had for David Hill. They had met while both were developing innovative technology projects. At the time, James trusted David completely, believing he had found a business partner with whom he could build something great. They shared ideas, plans, and visions for the future. But what James never foresaw was the betrayal that would follow. David, driven by greed and the desire to consolidate his empire, stole one of James's greatest ideas, an innovative project for software that would revolutionize the digital security industry. James had every intention of launching the product with David as equal partners, but David patented the idea alone, leaving James out of the success that followed. The fortune of David and the growth of Hill Industries were built on the idea that rightfully belonged to Mark's father. Mark would never forget the day his father came home, devastated. "He ruined us," James had said, his voice shaking. "I trusted him, Mark. I thought we were partners, but he was just waiting for the right moment to stab me in the back." James had tried to fight, to take legal action, but with the power and connections David already possessed, the chances of winning were nearly impossible. In no time, James's company went bankrupt and their family spiraled into financial ruin. Slowly, things became unbearable. Mark's mother had to take on temporary jobs, and Mark, still a teenager, had to abandon many of his dreams to help support the household. James, unable to cope with the humiliation and failure, fell into a deep depression and was never the same again. Though he tried to recover, the betrayal had shattered him. He passed away a few years later, leaving Mark and his mother to pick up the pieces. Now, over a decade later, Mark was on the verge of marrying the daughter of the man who caused it all. At first, it seemed like a cruel twist of fate, but his love for Emily was genuine. He never saw her as part of the problem. In fact, she had always been his source of support and happiness. But the weight of David's betrayal had always been there, a shadow he couldn't completely ignore. When Mark began building his own company, Tech Dynamics, he had one clear goal: to restore his family's legacy and create something that no one could take from him. It wasn't easy, but unlike David, he did it with honesty. Now, after years of hard work, his company was thriving, and a recent multi-million-dollar contract with a major tech conglomerate had placed him in a prominent position in the industry. But there was something David and the guests at that wedding didn't know. This new contract not only solidified Mark's success, but it also posed a direct threat to Hill Industries. David, unaware, was about to face the consequences of his past actions, and in that moment, Mark knew the truth needed to be told. He could no longer carry this burden in silence. Mark gazed at the horizon, feeling a mixture of nervousness and resolve. He had envisioned this day many times, the moment he would confront David Hill and reveal the past he had always tried to hide. Doubt gnawed at him. Would this be fair to Emily? She knew he came from a modest family, but she had never heard the full story of her father's betrayal. Still, Mark felt it was time. He wasn't just fighting for himself, but for his father's legacy. And Emily deserved to know the whole truth before they started their life together. It was a risk, but one he was willing to take. As he walked back to the reception, the air felt heavier, but Mark's decision was made. He knew the revelations that would unfold that night would change everything, but this time he would be in control. Mark returned to the reception hall, his mind made up. The bright lights and constant hum of conversation surrounded him, but all he could focus on was what was about to happen. He felt the weight of the truth he had carried for so long. Emily was talking to one of her close friends when he approached, gently touching her shoulder. She turned, smiling. "Hey, everything okay?" Emily asked, her expression tender. Mark looked at her for a moment, trying to take in the beauty of that instant. He wanted to remember how she looked before everything changed. "Yes, everything's fine," he replied, his voice soft. "But can we talk after the vows?" Emily frowned slightly, confused. "Sure. Is something wrong?" Mark shook his head. "I just need you to trust me, okay?" Emily squeezed his hand tightly, her smile returning. "Always." The master of ceremonies announced that the newlyweds would soon say their vows, drawing the attention of the guests. Mark felt his heart race. This was the moment he had waited for, yet also the moment he had always dreaded. He glanced over at David Hill, who was surrounded by other business magnates, laughing and drinking, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. As the room quieted and all eyes turned to the couple, Mark took a deep breath. Emily, standing beside him, smiled at him, her eyes filled with emotion. She had prepared her vows with so much love, but for Mark, this would be a very different speech from what anyone expected. He held the microphone, his hand slightly trembling, but his voice steady as he began to speak. "Emily, when I met you, I had no idea how much you would change my life. You showed me what it means to truly love, without prejudice, without judgment. And for that, I will always be grateful." Emily smiled, her face glowing with happiness as the guests watched, many still holding champagne glasses. "But before I make my vows," Mark continued, feeling the weight of his next words, "there's something that needs to be said. Not just to you, but to everyone here." The room fell into a deeper silence, and Mark felt the gaze of every person on him. David, who had been casually chatting with one of his associates, slowly turned his attention to the groom, his expression one of mild curiosity. Mark looked at Emily, who now appeared slightly unsettled. "I love you, Emily, and I've never lied to you. But there's something I never told you. Something that happened many years ago, and it involves your father." David shifted in his chair, as if struck by an invisible blow. His expression grew tense, but he remained silent. Murmurs began to circulate among the guests, who were now completely focused. "What's going on?" Emily asked, her voice low, but filled with concern. Mark turned his gaze to David, Emily's father, who was now staring back at him with a calculated expression. This was the moment Mark had feared, but he knew the truth had to come out. "Your father, David Hill, destroyed my family," Mark said, his voice echoing through the hall. "He betrayed my father, James Anderson, by stealing the idea that made his company, Hill Industries, the success it is today. My father trusted him, believed they were partners, but David stole his invention, leaving my family in ruins." The hall was stunned. The curious looks had turned to ones of shock and disbelief. David, who had been silent until that moment, suddenly stood up from his chair. "This is ridiculous!" David exclaimed, his voice laced with anger. "You're making up lies." Mark kept his gaze fixed on David. "They're not lies. You know it's the truth, David. You destroyed my father. He could never recover. He died knowing he had been betrayed by someone he trusted." Emily stood frozen beside Mark, her eyes wide in disbelief. "This can't be true. Mark, you never told me this." Mark turned to her, his heart aching at the pain in her eyes. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how. I didn't want it to affect what we have. But I can't keep this a secret anymore. You needed to know before we start our life together." David, clearly furious, stepped forward. "You really think you can come here, at my daughter's wedding, and smear my name with these outrageous accusations? I did what any businessman would do. Your father was a dreamer. He didn't have what it took to bring that idea to market." Mark didn't flinch. "My father had integrity, David. Something you never had." The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Some were too shocked to react, while others glanced at David with new doubts in their eyes. Linda, Emily's mother, seemed frozen in her seat, unsure of where to look. Emily, on the other hand, looked torn between hurt and disbelief. She had trusted Mark with all her heart, but now she was discovering there had been an unspoken war between the man she loved and the father she respected. "Mark, why didn't you ever tell me this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I love you, Emily, and I didn't want my past to interfere with our future. But now I realize I had to be honest. I can't start this life with you while carrying this weight." David stepped forward again, trying to regain control. "Emily, darling, you can't believe these lies. This man, he's trying to manipulate you." Emily looked from her father to Mark, her mind racing as she tried to process everything she had just heard. Mark, feeling his heart tighten as he saw Emily's confusion, finished. "I'm not trying to manipulate you. I'm just trying to be honest, something your father never was." The tension in the room was almost palpable, and every eye was on Emily, waiting for her reaction. But in that moment, she didn't know what to think or who to believe. The room seemed frozen in time. All eyes were on Emily, her face filled with pure conflict. The silence between her, Mark, and her father, David, stretched on endlessly as the guests watched, unsure how to react. Mark's words still hung in the air, while Emily struggled to process the reality of the situation. Could it be possible that the man she admired so much, her father, was capable of such a cruel betrayal? David maintained his usual dignified posture, but Mark could see the nervousness in his hands, gripping the back of his chair tightly. The control David usually exhibited in tense situations was beginning to slip away. "Emily, listen to me," David said, finally breaking the silence. "This man is using you to get to me. He wants to destroy everything our family has built. You can't let him do this." Emily looked at her father, but something in his voice now sounded different to her. The authority and confidence she had always associated with him seemed tainted with doubt. "Dad, I don't know what to think. Is this true? Did you really do this to Mark's father?" David straightened, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "I did what was necessary, Emily. His father didn't have the vision to turn that idea into something great. I made the decisions any businessman would." "That doesn't sound like vision, David. It sounds like theft," Mark responded, his voice steady but controlled. He knew they were reaching a critical point. What he said next could change everything. David tried to laugh, but it came out forced, lacking his usual confidence. "Theft? That's ridiculous. Do you really think you can come here, on your wedding day, and make these kinds of accusations without proof? I've built a solid company, an empire. You can't tear me down with empty words." Mark took a deep breath and smirked slightly. "Empty words? They're not just words, David. In fact, my company, Tech Dynamics, just secured a multi-million-dollar contract that's going to redefine the digital security industry. A contract, by the way, that will directly compete with what you offer." The murmurs in the room grew louder. This was more than just a family accusation. It was a direct threat to the empire David had built. David furrowed his brow, clearly confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'm saying that your arrogance blinded you, David. While you've been coasting on past successes, I've been building something new. Something that's going to make your company look outdated," Mark said, crossing his arms. "And now, with the contract I just signed, Tech Dynamics is ready to take the lead in the market. In fact, many of your clients are already in talks with me." David's eyes widened, and the panic, which had been well disguised until now, finally appeared on his face. He turned to one of his associates, sitting at the same table, as if seeking an explanation. This can't be true. He's bluffing." Mark shrugged, keeping his gaze fixed on David. Go ahead and ask your clients then. You might find out sooner than you expected." The weight of Mark's words reverberated through the room, and guests began exchanging glances, realizing that something much bigger was happening here. David, who had always been the unquestionable figure of power in that room, was losing his footing. For the first time, he looked small in the face of the situation. Emily watched in silence, unable to take her eyes off Mark. The man she loved, who had always seemed so humble, was now revealing himself as a powerful force, not only personally, but professionally. The revelation about the contract was a blow she hadn't anticipated, and it only intensified the conflicting emotions inside her. Mark turned his attention back to Emily. "I didn't want it to be like this, not on our wedding day, but you needed to know the truth about me, about my family, and about what happened between our fathers. I couldn't move forward without being honest with you." Emily bit her lip, struggling with the emotions bubbling inside her. "Mark, I need time to think," she said, her voice weak but sincere. "This is a lot to process." Mark nodded, understanding her confusion. He couldn't expect her to handle it all at once. "I understand. I just want you to know that I'm here, for whatever you need." David, however, wasn't ready to let things end this way. "You're playing dirty, Mark. This isn't justice, it's revenge." Mark stared back at him. "Revenge? No, David. This is justice. It's what you should have expected from the day you betrayed my father. And now, it's happening." The silence in the room was suffocating. Everyone watched, breathless, as the balance of power shifted before their eyes. David Hill, the magnate, was being challenged in a way he had never imagined. Not by another powerful businessman, but by Mark, the man he had so openly despised. David took a deep breath, his posture crumbling piece by piece. "You're going to regret this." Mark looked at him, resolute. "No, David, the one who will regret this is you." The atmosphere was heavy, the tension almost tangible. Mark knew that this revelation was just the beginning. The consequences of that night would ripple far beyond the reception hall, impacting businesses and lives alike. But for the first time in many years, he felt he had done the right thing. The truth was finally out. Emily was still reeling from the whirlwind of revelations that had turned her wedding into a public tribunal. Her father, the man she had always admired for his strength and success, was now seen in a completely different light. And Mark, her husband, the man she loved, was at the center of it all. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest. The guests stood in silence, waiting for her reaction, but Emily didn't know what to say or do. Her mind spun with the flood of information. How could she reconcile the love she felt for Mark with the loyalty and respect she'd always had for her father? David's betrayal seemed too big to ignore, yet he was still her father. And Mark, with his relentless pursuit of justice, had made everything public. Was he incapable of forgiveness? David, still standing beside Emily, gave her a desperate look, seeking her support. "Emily, you have to believe me," he said, his voice filled with an urgency she had never heard before. "Everything I did to secure the future of our family. Your future?" Emily turned to him, her face full of doubt. "Dad, how could you do something like that? You built everything at the expense of someone else, of Mark's father. How can I see you the same way after this?" David sighed, his confident facade crumbling. "Emily, the business world is ruthless. Your father, he was a good man, but he was also a businessman. Sometimes we have to make hard decisions." Mark stepped in, his voice steady but sharp. "Hard decisions, David? Betraying someone who trusted you isn't a hard decision. It's a choice. A choice you made out of greed, and now you're trying to justify it." David glared at Mark with disdain. "And what did you do today, Mark? This is revenge masquerading as justice. You used my daughter's wedding as a platform to get back at me. That's not noble, it's petty." Mark remained calm, but his words were cutting. "This isn't about revenge, David. It's about restoring what was stolen. For years, you lived comfortably off a success that wasn't yours. Today, that ends." Emily, still torn, looked between the two men. She couldn't deny that there was truth in both of their words. She felt like she was being pulled apart by the two most important men in her life. I don't know what to do," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I love you, Mark, but all of this." Mark looked at her, the pain visible in his eyes. "I never wanted it to be this way, Emily. I never wanted you caught in the middle of this, but I couldn't keep hiding the truth." Emily turned to her father, tears welling up in her eyes. "Dad, I always believed you were a just man. Now, I don't know what to think." David tried to step closer, but Emily stepped back, avoiding his touch. The disappointment on her face was clear. David reached out, but there were no words that could repair the damage. Emily, with a heavy heart, knew she needed time to process everything. I need a moment," she said, her voice breaking, before turning and walking toward the doors of the hall. The silence in the room was deafening. The guests continued to watch, unsure of what to do. Mark watched as Emily walked away, his heart aching. He knew he couldn't force her to make a decision now. All he could do was wait. David stood frozen, powerless, as his daughter left. He knew something irrevocable had happened, something that couldn't be easily fixed. Mark, feeling the magnitude of what had been revealed, stayed silent. He didn't know what the next steps would be, but one thing was certain. The dynamics of their family relationship would never be the same. Emily stepped out of the hall, her heart racing. The cool air outside hit her, but it didn't bring the relief she had hoped for. She stopped near a decorative fountain, watching the water swirl in circles as her mind tried to sort through the chaos of her thoughts. Everything she had known seemed to have crumbled in a single day. Her father, once seen as a model of success and integrity, was now revealed to be marked by greed, and Mark, the man she loved, had brought a devastating truth to light, on the day that should have been the happiest of their lives. Emily took a deep breath, trying to contain the overwhelming emotions. How could she possibly choose between them? Mark had confronted her with a truth he had hidden for so long, but he had done it in a way that left her exposed and vulnerable. Her father, on the other hand, had lied for years, concealing choices that had destroyed another family. It felt like any decision she made would be a betrayal. As Emily reflected, she heard footsteps approaching. Mark appeared beside her, silent. He didn't say anything for a while, giving her the space she needed, but finally, he broke the silence. "Emily," he began, his voice low and filled with regret. "I'm so sorry for all of this. I never wanted our wedding day to be like this. I never wanted you to go through this." She continued staring at the fountain, not responding immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but full of pain. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Mark? We could have handled this differently." Mark sighed, his eyes heavy with remorse. "I wanted to tell you. Believe me, I did many times. But I kept wondering how you'd react, how it would affect your relationship with your dad. I didn't want to be the reason for a rift between you two." Emily closed her eyes, feeling tears well up. "And now I'm forced to choose between my father and you, between the truth and what I've always believed. It's not fair, Mark." He looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. "I know it's not fair, but the truth had to come out, Emily. I couldn't start our life together with this lie between us, and what your father did, it destroyed my family. I couldn't carry that alone anymore." Emily turned to face him, tears now streaming down her face. "I understand, Mark. I understand why you did what you did, but it doesn't make this any easier." Mark looked at her with compassion, knowing he had created a deep wound between her and her family. "I never wanted you to have to make this choice. I know how much your father means to you, but I also know what he did to my family. He took everything from us." Emily knew Mark was right. Everything he had said about his family's past was true, but that didn't make the situation any more bearable. The image of her father, once so pristine, was crumbling before her eyes, and it broke her heart. After a long moment of silence, Emily spoke, her voice shaky but resolute. "My father, he did something wrong. He took something that wasn't his, and I can't ignore that. I can't keep pretending it didn't happen because it affected you, and I love you. But he's still my father, and part of me still loves him, even knowing what he's capable of." Mark nodded, understanding the pain she carried. "I know you love him, Emily, and I'm not asking you to cut ties with him. I just needed you to know the truth so we could build our future honestly." Emily wiped her tears and looked at him, her expression firm. "Mark, I choose you. I choose the truth. I choose the love we've built together. But that doesn't mean I'm turning my back on my father. He'll have to live with what he did, and I can't carry that burden for him. He needs to face the consequences." Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. He knew this wasn't easy for Emily, but her decision brought him a wave of relief and gratitude. "I never wanted you to feel pressured, Emily. I just want us to build our life on what's right, on what's just." Emily nodded, her heart still heavy, but sure of her decision. "We will, and we'll do it together." Mark embraced her, feeling the mix of relief and pain blend into a moment of mutual understanding. They both knew the road ahead would be difficult, but the truth was out, and somehow that brought the clarity they both needed. "I love you, Emily," Mark whispered, holding her tightly. "I love you too," she replied, holding him just as firmly. "And we'll get through this, together." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the gentle breeze of the night surrounded them, and the future, uncertain as it was, seemed a little clearer. It wouldn't be easy to reconcile the past, but Emily knew she had made the right choice. The choice for love and for truth. Mark and Emily walked back into the hall hand in hand, the weight of the decision she had made still lingering in the air. Although nothing was fully resolved, they both knew that choosing love and honesty would provide the foundation for them to move forward. As they re-entered, the guests watched them, some still whispering about what had transpired, while others simply observed, unsure of how to react. David stood in the corner of the room, engaged in a serious conversation with a few of his associates. When he saw Emily approaching, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and wounded pride. She knew he wouldn't admit his mistakes easily, but that was his burden to carry now. It was no longer hers. Emily walked towards her father with determined steps, Mark just behind her, offering the quiet support she so desperately needed. David straightened when he saw his daughter coming, but the hardness in his gaze was beginning to crumble. "Dad," Emily began, her voice firm but without anger. "I love you, but what you did was wrong, and I'm not the one who's going to fix it for you. You'll have to deal with the consequences of your actions." David opened his mouth to argue, but when he saw the resolve in his daughter's eyes, he realized she had already made up her mind. He bowed his head for a moment, as if absorbing the magnitude of his past choices. He knew that his relationship with Emily would never be the same, and that Mark was now a permanent part of her life, someone he couldn't push away. "I understand," David finally said, his voice low, weighed down by a defeat he rarely experienced. "I did what I thought was necessary at the time, but maybe I lost myself along the way." Emily watched him, feeling a deep sadness, but also relief. She knew that this moment of acknowledgement, while not a full apology, was the closest her father could come to admitting his wrongs for now. She took a deep breath, allowing some of the anger and hurt to dissolve. Not completely, but enough to take the first step toward healing. "I hope one day you can redeem yourself, Dad," she said, and without waiting for a response, she turned to Mark, signaling that they were ready to move on. The couple left the hall amidst curious glances and a few sympathetic smiles. Outside, the night air felt lighter, as if the weight of revelations, tough decisions, and bitter truths had begun to lift. The future remained uncertain, but there was a newfound clarity between them, a mutual understanding that what they would build together would be founded on integrity, respect, and love. Mark looked at Emily, holding her hand firmly. "I guess the wedding didn't go exactly as we planned, huh?" Emily chuckled softly, despite everything. "Definitely not. But in a way, it feels like the beginning of something bigger than we ever imagined." Mark smiled, agreeing. "Yeah, and despite it all, I'm glad we went through it together." She gazed at him, her eyes filled with love. "Me too. It's going to be hard, but we'll get through it." "We will," Mark said confidently, "and we'll do it the right way." As they walked away from the hotel, leaving behind the tensions and family drama, a new perspective opened before them. The path they had chosen wasn't the easiest, but it was the most honest. And together, they knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Mark squeezed Emily's hand one more time, and they walked towards the future, knowing that, despite the difficulties, they were ready to start this new phase of their lives, a phase of love, justice, and redemption.